Let's bring in Richard Parker, a columnist with the Houston Chronicle. He's from El Paso. He's also the author of Lone Star Nation, How Texas Will Transform America, as well as Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press. Let me start with the view from El Paso. We just talked to Congresswoman Escobar and our colleague Jacob Soboroff. There is a large contingent that does not want to see Air Force One touch down there in that community today.
No, that's correct. You know, in the interviews that I've done with people here, a 62-year-old woman, a 20-year-old Army private, and others, you know, there's a great deal of sadness and fear, but there's another feeling that comes with the shock of something like this, and that's anger. And what sets this apart was that this was a political act aimed at an ethnic group that numbers 60 million people in the United States, and no one I've talked to at this point is not upset with the President of the United States.
Let me read a little bit from your piece, because I read it before and it moved me. I'm reading it again and it's moving me again. You write, beneath the merciless desert sun, a shrine rises in the most unlikely of locations, a broiling parking lot where a monument of homemade crosses, flowers, and notes to the dead is crowned by a Walmart sign. Soaring in the barren sky, Latinos, my people in American history. And so the white crosses are covered with wishes in English and the names of the dead in Spanish. There are 22 crosses. On the right, amidst the flowers and plastic hearts, are two people I knew, Jordan and Andre. You want to tell us about them?
Yeah, I met their family on Saturday, and they were looking for one of the children that had gone missing in the Walmart. And I think theirs is probably the most poignant story that comes out of this great tragedy. They were a young couple, only 25 and 26 years old. They had only briefly been married. And in fact, they were at this Walmart location right across from us on a shopping trip, according to one of their grandfathers. They were there to buy a few things to have a housewarming party. They were going to go home to their new house and welcome friends and family. And in the process, they were gunned down trying to protect their very small children. And I think if I certainly remember anything from this tragedy, the massacre in El Paso, it will be the name of the Anchondos.
Richard, I've seen you on television around the clock since your piece showed up in the New York Times on Sunday. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I have feared as a reporter or just a journalist that this day would come for about 3 years, since the president announced his candidacy by calling Mexicans rapists. I am of Mexican descent myself. I grew up in this town. I was unfortunately not shocked that it took place, but I was really shocked that it happened here. This is a pretty quiet, peaceful city. It's a big city if you include Ciudad Juarez, 2.3 million people. And it's not perfect by any means. I know that it has its flaws, but it's not a violent town. And in a majority Hispanic, binational city, this is the kind of thing that's just never happened here. No one would ever think of doing this here.
Richard Parker, we're going to call on you again and again and again. This is not a story that any of us are going to forget for a very long time. Thanks for being with us today. We'll call on you again. I'm going to go back to my colleague, Jacob Soboroff. Jacob? I'm sorry. We're going to start.
Nicolle,
Hi, Jacob.
So O'Rourke is here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, why don't you come back just in a minute? Reverend Dr. William Barber, a familiar face to all of us at MSNBC, is on stage about to give a prayer. We're going to let him do that, and then we're going to grab Beto O'Rourke after that. So I'll come back to you in a second.
Okay, all right. Out of respect for that moment, we'll let Jacob keep his voice down. Jonathan Lemire, take me inside Donald Trump's wild adventure today to one grieving city, grabs his phone, gets on Air Force One, attacks some local officials in Ohio, attacks former Vice President Joe Biden, and now should be about to descend on a city where there is not a lot of agreement that his presence is contributing to their healing.
Actually, Nicolle, according to my colleagues in the press pool, Air Force One just touched down in the last minute or two. So the president has arrived in El Paso, and certainly there are very divided feelings waiting there to greet him. There's a lot of protesters there. You've been cutting back and forth to the event with the prayer and public speakers. And we have seen time and time again that this today is following a familiar pattern for this president when he responds to acts of tragedy, whether it's a natural disaster or if it's man-made. He can hit the right notes in person. You know, he can go to the hospital and say the right things, but then when he retreats to the safety of his cabin aboard Air Force One or back to the White House in the residence that evening, he puts on the cable news and he turns to Twitter and he reacts. And we're seeing that now. It is remarkable, though, midday, flying from one grieving city to another, that he's already launched the political attacks after starting his day at the White House claiming he was going to tone down his rhetoric and being critical of others for playing politics with these tragedies. He is doing exactly that, which he has done time and time again. Now, what we're expecting in El Paso is to also follow sort of a familiar pattern when he visits cities like this. We just saw in Dayton as he went to the hospital, visited with a few victims, gave thanks to a few first responders, stayed away from the shooting scene, stayed away from the protests. There's an expectation that that will be the same here in El Paso. We don't anticipate him going to the Walmart, but rather meeting with first responders, getting an update on the investigation, and talking to some of the victims and their families. And I want to stress this. Steering clear of the protest. Donald Trump has never had an easy time seeing protesters lining the streets near the motorcade. And the White House, particularly in recent months, have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep those images from him. I'm remembering last year in Parkland, when he was there after that school shooting, he went nowhere near the school itself or where the protests were and just paid a quiet visit to a hospital. But most strikingly, this past year in London, where he was there, and there were huge protests greeting him in the British capital. And instead of just driving 2 or 3 miles where he'd have to see them, they took helicopters to avoid them, to fly well above the protests. We're not expecting that today. But again, it shows you, and we're seeing it with these tweets too, how sensitive he is to any sort of criticism and how he can't hold his tongue. He has to hit back, even on a day that should just be about solemn and healing.
It's a remarkable analysis, John Heilelmann, to be speaking on a day, and Richard's pain is palpable. Maria Hinojos' pain yesterday was palpable. I mean, people from El Paso all talk about their city the same way. None of them sugarcoat it. It's not perfect, but you heard Congresswoman Escobar talk about it as sort of a bubble where they made it work. Violence came to them from 10 hours away. But on a day where our focus should be on the victims, Jonathan Lemire is correct to point out that it's at least worth reporting from a White House reporter's perspective that Donald Trump is sensitive, prickly, and angry.
And incapable of exercising just a very basic human quality that's not about politics. This is like just, John mentioned that Trump has had trouble in moments of crisis, right? Or there's been a disaster of some kind, a natural disaster. But this is it's not just any kind of disaster. It's a very particular kind of thing here. A mass shooting, 2 mass shootings over one weekend in which the country is clearly racked and in anguish over this moment, right? The notion, just to say the words, between one city and the other, Donald Trump attacked.
Right, it's like
the mayor attacked.
Bizarre.
Attacked Sherrod Brown. Attacked Joe Biden. Like, it's not. I mean, we apply interesting kinds of political analysis around the public performance of candidates and elected office holders all the time, and sometimes you're measuring with a micrometer, like how good the person is versus someone else. This is not a political skill. This is something any normal, sane human being would be like, you know what? On today, what am I going to do? Well, I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to attack anyone. Mm-hmm. Like, it's the easiest thing in the world. These are 2 cities that have just been attacked. But how hard is it to think to yourself, I will not attack anyone for today? The president has so little impulse control and so little basic humanity that he can't manage. You know what? Joe Biden's going to be around for a long time. You can attack him anytime you want. You can attack Sherrod Brown anytime you want. You just for a day. Impossible, incapable. We can't expect even that little basic thing from this president and this human being in this moment. It's kind of incredible.
It's because we cannot expect from this president one basic shred of empathy or sympathy for anyone other than himself and perhaps his children. And I think, Congressman Escobar touched on something very important. One of the reasons for Latinos why this is aside from the carnage and the loss of lives, one of the reasons why this is so profoundly shocking is that for so many Mexican Americans, El Paso figures very prominently in our stories of origin. Going all the way back to the Mexican Revolution, that's when people from northern Mexico, El Paso del Norte, that was the original name of the city, that was the gateway to the United States. That's where our family's history in this country began. And, you know, the diaspora has gone on to all the Southwest, all over the country. But people think of El Paso like, that's where my great-grandpa came from. That's where my grandma, you know, started the United States. That this would happen there. And El Paso is the kind of place, if you're Latino and you grow up there, you don't feel like a minority. You don't feel like that brown kid. You're just a kid. So it really hits home when Congresswoman Escobar says that it is very shattering to the young people in that city because they don't grow up there with that type of discrimination or hate or animosity in the hometown. It's not there. It's from outside.
And I worked for a politician from Texas. I mean, her description of Texas as a bubble is right. I mean, because there are the national politics and then there are Texas politics. And Texas has a long history of bipartisanship, not just in the hour of trial. I mean, it's how we're talking about being decent in the moment of the most. I mean, I think this is the deadliest attack on the Latino community in this country, in our country's history. So it's really rising to a real occasion, not just a presidential occasion, not just a moment. It's so unprecedented, though. You know, I think about sort of the most. Challenging moments of the Bush presidency. Katrina had to be among them. He was in New Orleans, and the response justifiably criticized from the right, left, the center, locally. He was in New Orleans week after week after week after week, making sure that that city was able to rebuild. He wasn't popular there politically. A lot of people blamed him for the federal government's response, but he went and he was part of rebuilding the city. I've just never seen anything like this.
Yeah, and obviously Donald Trump won't be back after today unless it's to come announce some crackdown on Tuesday.
I think Jason jumped in. Let me get to you, Jason, then we'll come back to Matt. Go ahead, sorry.
I have to say this because all of you guys are mentioning something that hits me. It's not just George Bush, but I will say this beyond the sort of politics. I'm not a fan of Rudy Giuliani, never have been. But after 9/11, he was America's mayor. Rudy Giuliani recognized that we were all so traumatized, right? George Bush recognized that we were all so traumatized that this was something that affected all of us. I will tell you this. I'm talking to friends in D.C. who are like, I'm nervous walking into Walmart now. I'm nervous walking into Target. Okay, I'm going to a conference in Miami this week. We're talking about increased security. We are all El Paso right now. We're all Dayton. And what a president is supposed to do, we've all seen that viral video of a car backfiring in Times Square and people scattering. The entire country is experiencing PTSD, and the President of the United States cannot do the most basic thing in the world, which is put his arms around this entire nation for once and say, I actually care about all of you. And that's the importance of not just these speeches that these 2020 candidates are making, but also these local politicians, because somebody needs to say that they love America even through trauma, because we're never going to hear that from this President of the United States.
Yeah, look, he won't be back in El Paso after today, but in some ways, Donald Trump's story is wrapped up in El Paso. You heard Richard Parker say he's been worried about an event like this for 3 years, since Donald Trump started talking about rapists coming across the border. El Paso is obviously a border city. I thought that it was ground zero for family separation under this administration in El Paso. If you look at the camps that were built outside El Paso that were housing children away from their parents. One hopeful thing that Congresswoman Escobar said, that she hopes this is a turning point. And for all that El Paso has had to suffer under this administration, and the people that live in El Paso and live all around the border have had to suffer under this president, maybe this will be the turning point, where the country recognizes that this is a president that encourages hatred and that there are consequences for living under that kind of leader.
Elise, I hear, and I'm sure you hear this too, this idea that nothing's going to shake anything loose, that the political moment is more static than it is dynamic. And I hear that, I'm sympathetic to that. But I'm with Matt, I'm with Jason. I think that the president, the failure is on too big of a scale. There are too many people watching, and now, as opposed to the first 2 years of his presidency, there are 20 Democrats making the case that you can do better. You can have me. And I think if the Democrats, and I think I was away, but I think some of what was lacking from that debate was going after each other, when I think most of them feel that any one of them would be better for the country than this.
And I think what was lacking from that debate was not enough talk about the issues that bind us all together,
Right.
and about how we can grow stronger together. How
Not
we
just the
can
Democrats,
be
but
better.
people like you and me too, right?
Exactly, exactly. And hearing that message of hope and addressing forthright and being open the hatred that is coming from Donald Trump and that he is systemically applying by his policies at the border. And I think that this is something that should unite us all as Americans. There should be no tolerance for this kind of language whatsoever. He isn't going to get a pass going forward and taken seriously, but not literally, when you know what? People are taking him literally. The shooter did in El Paso. The shooter did at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, too.
I also want to go ahead.
Guys, just a very quick thing.
Yeah, and then I have a politics question on immigration.
If Democrats after this week do not, if they haven't already done this, look back at those 2 nights of those debates, especially the second one, and people have pointed out how idiotic it was for Law to be attacking Barack Obama, right? They spent a lot of the time in that second debate attacking the Obama legacy. You know, and I sort of understand why some of it happened, but if after this week Democrats don't understand the folly, the idiocy, the moronic calculus that's going into that, you know, God, Barack Obama had flaws, but this week makes just epically clear how insane it is for Democrats to be focusing not on anything but Donald Trump, and let alone to be focusing on Barack Obama, who, again, he had some failures, but just think about how he performed in these moments when he was president.
My colleague Jacob Soboroff is joined by Beto O'Rourke. No one has made a stronger, more blunt case about Donald Trump than your guest, Jacob.
And Nicolle Wallace just said nobody has made a stronger or more blunt case about Donald Trump than you have, Congressman. Right now, the president is on the tarmac greeting members of the Texas delegation. He's on El Paso soil. What goes through your head hearing that?
Well, I think this is the answer to that. You have all these beautiful people from El Paso, but also from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, our sister city, who are coming together in the wake of this horrific loss of life, this terrorism that was in part inspired by President Trump and his warnings of invasions and infestations, his demonization of this community, immigrants as rapists and criminals. There's a very real consequence to that. It doesn't just offend us, it hurts us and it kills us. And so this community is coming together, focusing on one another, on making sure that those families heal. Wish the president had not come, but we're going to stay focused on El Paso.
And as you said, the reality is, the fact of the matter is, he is here. Right now, he's shaking hands with his political allies. We talked about earlier today how you, your successor, Congresswoman Escobar, chose not to participate in that at all. You've seen a lot of big rallies. Looking out at this crowd today, when you looked out at this one, how was it different for you?
Oh, it's just beautiful. I mean, here we are under a beautiful sky, a broiling sun. It's probably 101 degrees. Folks have been out here for hours listening to Congresswoman Escobar, now listening to Reverend William Barber, listening to one another, listening to dreamers, and celebrating the best of who we are. This is one of the safest cities in America, not despite, but because it's a city of immigrants. And I think though we bore the brunt of this attack and this hatred and this racism, we also hold the answer for this country that is so divided right now. There's a way to come together, not despite our differences, but by embracing our differences. That's what's made El Paso so special.
You've been very clear that you believe the president, in large part, is to blame for what happened over the weekend here in El Paso. How worried are you that with Donald Trump still in the Oval Office, something like this will inevitably happen again?
It will happen again, because what happened in El Paso is not an isolated incident. After the president warned of caravans, you had somebody go into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, warning of caravans. You had the mosque in Victoria, Texas, burned to the ground on the day that Trump signed his executive order seeking to ban Muslim travel to the United States. So there are very real consequences to his words, to his tweets, to the racism that he fans. You saw this in May at a rally in Florida. He says, how are we going to stop these people, meaning these immigrants, from coming to this country? Someone yells out, shoot them. The crowd roars their approval.
He laughs.
He laughs. He says, that's okay with me. So he's not the source of racism in this country. This country's been racist as long as it's been a country, but he is certainly fanning the flames. He is certainly making violence like this more possible and more real until we change course.
You've been very clear that you believe the president is a racist. Is the president a white supremacist?
He is. He's also made that very clear. He's dehumanized or sought to dehumanize those who do not look like or pray like the majority here in this country. He said, I wish we had more immigrants from Nordic countries because those from Haiti bring AIDS. Those from Africa come from shithole nations. He's been very clear about who he prefers to be in this country and who he literally wants to keep out with walls and cages and militarization and torture and cruelty. And again, we in El Paso have borne the brunt of all of that, but we in El Paso are standing up to all of that right now. And I've never been more proud of this community than I am at this moment.
All right, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, appreciate it. Nice to see you again today.
Appreciate it. Yep.
Nicolle, he's right. It's a 101-degree day out here, but it is really extraordinary to see the strength of this crowd, the unity of this crowd, the way everybody is coming together out here, even though many of these folks, maybe all of these folks, don't want to see the President of the United States here today.
Jacob, stay with us. I want to underscore two things. I think this presidential race will never be the same. You know how one of the top candidates has described Donald J. Trump, an incumbent president, as a white supremacist, changing the contours of this race from this point forward.
I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing to say, but Beto O'Rourke consistently has pointed to the underlying documentation, the receipts, if you will, about the way that the president talks about people of color in this country, and it's long preceded what happened here this weekend. I mean, ad nauseum, we've talked about it, but the minute he came down the escalator, Mexicans are rapists and criminals. Congresswomen of color in this country should go back to where they came from. We've seen infestations and invasions, and the separation of children along the border started right here in El Paso. The pilot program in 2017 happened not far from where we are in the El Paso Border Patrol sector. So if you look at everything in isolation, you know, maybe that there's a case to be made, but Beto O'Rourke says we have to synthesize it. We have to look at it as a whole, and his conclusion is that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is a white supremacist.
Jacob, I don't know if you have somewhere to go, but if you could hang out with us for a few more minutes. I want to come back to the interview, but I want to get some quick reaction from Jason Johnson. I believe the Democratic primary, there will be the day before Beto O'Rourke called Donald Trump a white supremacist, and the day after. I think the Democratic primary now changed the face of it, the feel of it. We came on the air with the Biden speech seemingly changing this Democratic primary, a litany of Donald Trump's racist rhetoric laid out and tied to the violence in El Paso. You now have Beto O'Rourke, a son of El Paso, someone who has been blunt in calling Donald Trump a racist, in tying the rhetoric to the violent, now saying, yes, he is indeed a white supremacist.
That is an amazing moment. I completely agree with you, Nicolle. And also this, not only does this give us the Beto moment, if we're going to talk pure politics, the Beto moment, but it also sets a new baseline for how these Democrats have to talk about this president. Because the extension of this, right, and we've seen this with Joaquin Castro, we've seen this with certain things that Joe Scarborough said is, since we have identified this president as being a white nationalist and a racist, that means if you support him, you bear some responsibility, which changes the complete dynamic of the 2020 race with many of these candidates like, well, we need to reach out to these. Well, do you? Do you now? Because if you are saying that you're trying to reach out to people who support white nationalism, racism, and domestic terrorism. So I think this is a new dividing line in the 2020 race. I think it's a welcome line. I think I'm glad that Democrats are going to walk across it and make a clear statement, because this is not just about good feelings in elections now. It's the soul of the nation, as Joe Biden said. It's about a racist president, and it's about us coming together and recognize what's really at stake.
And, Raul, he's right. Joe Scarborough is one of the voices most out front. In asking questions about Donald Trump's donors and what they are donating to.
Right. And as a result of today, everyone who's running these Democratic, they're hopeful, their campaigns, they are figuring out their answer to that question right now, because that's going to be a question that goes down the line at those debates. And another question that's a byproduct of that, and this is in terms of the whole party, is this party going to continue to try and reach a slice of these rural, these Midwestern voters that turned out very strongly for Trump and are still sticking by him, if the Democratic candidates believe that they are supporting a white supremacist? Or are they going to try and go a more progressive route and bring in new voters, bring in women of color, bring in Latino voters, bring in more African Americans? So I think it's also going to potentially change the way the party approaches voter outreach. And just that, it's amazing how a small statement like that is going to have major implications in the next debate and the next course of this race.
And I guess part of me is surprised it took so long for someone to say it, because Donald Trump, in an interview, I believe, with Fox Business, described himself as a proud nationalist. And it's just two more ticks along the dial to being a white supremacist, right?
Yeah, look, that was the Beto O'Rourke that a lot of people fell in love with in the 2018 Senate campaign. Someone who was willing to say things that he knew were true, that he believed in his heart and didn't worry about the political blowback. And I think we've seen that since this tragedy in El Paso. You saw him, he had that great moment on the, where he asked reporters, like,
what the bleep?
Look, what, I was trying to figure out how I was going to say that on the air. And that is the point. I mean, look, the Democrats need to frame this election in moral terms. We need to make clear that it's not just questions of health care, and it's not just questions of gun control, and it's not just questions of immigration. Those are all really important, but this says something about who we are as a country. And voting for a white supremacist is not a moral choice. Supporting a white supremacist is not a moral choice.
This is what I wanted to come to with you on the politics. Democrats are in this. They're wrapped around the axle, I think, of feeling like some of the positions on immigration, crossing the border, decriminalizing that, so polarizing. I mean, those are bad choices, bad debates. There is a chance here to reframe the whole conversation around immigration policy, around the kinds of stories that Jacob covers, in these moral terms.
Well, I think they have to do that for sure. And look, I think there's this big American argument that we're having, and I think that whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being is going to be someone who's able to do that. That's the ability to have a conversation that addresses both that presents themselves as the person who can fight Donald Trump and win, but can also restore the best parts of America, the things that we think of as the best parts, and beat back the worst parts of it. That is going to be who the nominee is. There are a handful of people who are trying to make their way towards that right now. But I do think there's this other piece that we know about in professional politics, which is everyone now looks at Trump and says, he's going to lose the popular vote and probably lose it by a reasonably large amount. Yeah. He's got the same narrow path towards re-election that he had in 2016. Only it's now harder. So how do those issues in finely fought contests in 30 counties in 4 states or 3 or 4 states? How do those issues play out there?
Votes.
That's where I think things get more complicated. You got to have the big stuff right to be the nominee, but then the questions, they really do matter, because it's a very narrow line he can walk, but he can walk that line, and Democrats have got to pay attention to that, how to make sure they win in the places they must win if they're going to stop from having Donald Trump get a second term.
All right, we must sneak in a really short break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.